privileged to have the opportunity to talk to you, sir. Look, enough has been said and written about the elements of an NDE. I mean, most people who are going to have a look at this know about this, and I'm going to put some text together with the video. Pim van Lommel, whom you obviously know, reckons that there are approximately 400,000 people who had an NDE in Belgium and about 600,000 in the Netherlands, in Holland,
Right.
which I think is still a conservative estimate.
I think so
Why?
too.
Yeah, why is it so difficult, you think, to convince them to come forward with their story, and should they come forward with their story? That's my
Well,
first question.
yeah, well, I feel that it's very important that people who have these experiences share them. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, Proof of Heaven, was I hoped that it would invite people to come out and share the experiences. I mean, the problem is this is not just kind of the expected extrapolation, of human existence beyond the body. It's a shocking thing to go through. In fact, most people describe that deep, profound spiritual experience is much more real, complex, vibrant, and alive than this material world and this material body. And so when it happens and you go through that, and for example, someone who experiences a life review and they have all these incredible scenes and they're feeling that emotional power of others, they're there with souls of loved ones who have left the physical world, and all of it is much more real than anything they're used to. In fact, in those realms, one of the problems is our modes of knowing are nowhere near as restricted as they are here. And when I'm here in this physical body, my information channels, like what I can see with the eyes and hear with the ears, is all very kind of confined and narrowed down to this little trickle of human awareness. And yet, when we're no longer dealing with consciousness that has been heavily filtered by the physical structures of our eyes and ears and brains and all that, it's really mind-blowing. I mean, it's really kind of indescribable. That's why so many people can't put this into words. And it's, I think that it's such a different mode of knowing that we seem to be the target of so much more information, and yet it flows through us in those spiritual realms. It's it's not as if we have to figure it out and run the show because there's so much going on there. But the reality is, people come back and they wonder about their sanity. I mean, it really is such a shocking experience to go through. It's no surprise that people are not necessarily willing to share it, although it's interesting that it provides such comfort to people. And yet, in this material world, that I think that's one of the reasons why it's very difficult for people to talk about it. And the more people understand that this is a common experience, that the majority of human beings go through this kind of thing, then we can start making more sense of it. But until we can kind of deal with it more, I mean, we're so used to in our culture treating death as this thing that you don't talk about. It's very much not something anybody looks forward to. And yet, what I would tell you is what my NDE taught me is that our human existence is far more than we can kind of understand just from being in these bodies, in these incarnations. And that's why, to me, it's all very exciting to learn so much more about all this. And we can look at all that as especially exciting when we realize that the scientific evidence for reincarnation is very, very strong. So in other words, we're not just talking about NDEs supporting a notion of the afterlife, but in fact, the much bigger view that I think the scientific world of consciousness studies is coming to is one where we acknowledge that reincarnation is built into the system and that we've all been here many times before. But there obviously, in that situation, there must be kind of walling off of knowledge. So there's certain things that we cannot know in certain realms. And that's why I believe in this material realm, we've forgotten. I mean, the people at Division of Perception Studies, University of Virginia, Jim Tucker, Ian Stevenson, the scientists who have studied past life memories in children, will tell you have to recover those memories before about age 5 or 6, because after that, the memories get covered over. And it's a natural process, just like we forget our dreams. We know dreaming is very important. In fact, if you don't dream and sleep, over a few weeks, it can be fatal. So we must sleep and dream, and animals sleep and dream. We don't understand why. We also know that those dreams are not necessarily remembered, but they serve a crucial function. Likewise, I would say between lives is kind of like that sleep period, and we don't necessarily come back with all that knowledge. And what young children come into this world with, as soon as they're able to communicate, they start losing those memories completely. So we're just expanding what the scientific world identifies as consciousness and human experience, and are trying to understand it all. Mm-hmm. And we can go a lot further than we ever could under that bleak and paltry fiction of materialist science that try to pretend that the brain creates consciousness, and therefore when the brain ends, your consciousness ends. That is not true, and that's what NDEs and many other experiences are telling us about the nature of consciousness.
Okay. In the subtitle of your latest book, in the translation at least, it says a neurosurgeon goes in search of the science of consciousness. In your opinion, how far are we from science and spiritualism speaking the same language, let alone trying to understand each other?
Well, I think we're getting a lot closer. I go a bit out on a limb. I often predict in my presentations and interviews that by the year 2028, no self-respecting scientific mind on Earth will doubt the reality not only of the afterlife, but of reincarnation. And truth be told, the answers are already there in many ways. I mean, I would say that for the scientists who study all of these phenomena of human consciousness, including near-death experiences, shared death experiences, past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation, precognition, psychokinesis, all these phenomena that materialist science scoffs at and says are impossible. Well, they're not impossible. They happen. And scientists who study them realize they're very true. I would say the evidence is already there for anyone who cares enough to do the research, to really dive into this and to study the literature. And of course, I would always suggest meditation, because you're never going to really think your way to all of this based on reading and kind of logical discussion. Personal experience is very important, and that's one of the things that Karen and I, we go around the world giving meditation play shops to people, and it's all about acknowledging that the only way to really get to these deepest answers is to go within. So much of that world can be described, but the description uses our weak and paltry language that really doesn't do it justice. And that's why going within is so important. Meditation, I would say that, in fact, someone who has a daily practice of in-depth meditation with a strong spiritual bent who really wants to get to these answers can come to know long before they're at the end of the use of this physical body that their soul is an eternal component of the universe. We can discover these things on our own. My partner, Karen Newell, and co-author of that book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that third book, she's never had a near-death experience, and yet she has accomplished through a dedicated program of meditation what I think is the very same identification and knowledge of that infinite loving force, eternity of soul, and the connectedness of consciousness. And so this is something we can all cultivate if we have an interest and want to learn about it. And again, this is not like some big mystery. If you get into the literature on this, you'll find out that it suggests far more likely than not is the reality that consciousness creates all of this emerging physical reality we see, and not the other way around. We are not some accidental product of, mechanistic flow of subatomic particles following the laws of quantum physics, kind of blindly arriving at the events that occur in human lives. There's much more going on here. And in fact, I would say that the deepest interpretation of modern quantum physics sees a top-down ordering of causality that is very important. George F.R. Ellis is a South African mathematician who's written extensively about top-down causation in quantum physics, and I would say that when you take some of that and also the notions of David Bohm originally with his implicate and explicit order, and then more currently the kind of version of quantum physics that comes out of Carlo Rovelli, especially tempered with some of the insights of Bernardo Kastrup, who's a big supporter of our work, who endorsed our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. Because, in fact, Bernardo and our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, really arrive at the same conclusion, that the best metaphysical position, philosophical position for understanding this universe is objective idealism. That is the notion that this, what we're talking about, this level of kind of assimilation and integration of information in the universe, which I would call the mental universe, is something that is very much acceptable to quantum physicists. Just go read Richard Conn Henry's essay, Mental Universe, in the scientific journal Nature back in 2005. Richard Conn Henry was the head of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins at the time. And he makes it very clear that there's a mental layer of ordering of information in this universe. And this is a layer that humans have access to because we have brains. We have consciousness that is filtered through this brain. And it is that consciousness that allows us to understand this universe much more fully. But it's not a consciousness that's being de novo created by the physical brain and by these random workings of subatomic particles in the substance of the brain.
Sure.
So we're just expanding our worldview to fully incorporate the human experience. Lots
of what you'll be telling, I've also read in a book for Steve Taylor. I'm sure you've heard Spiritual Science, very interesting.
I love that book.
It's a good one, isn't it? I finished it today and a lot of stuff became a lot clearer to me. Obviously, the 3 books I've got, your books are also in Belgium very popular, very successful, selling very well. What is success? Why do you think, are your books so successful?
Well, I think there's a large contingent of people in this world, especially those who paid any attention to consciousness, brain, and mind, and the kind of scientific explanations of human experience, and they realize that a lot is missing. And in fact, the people who claim to know so much, neuroscientists who study the brain and claim to understand something about consciousness, seem to be the least informed about any of it in terms of trying to explain things like near-death experiences and past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. And I've often felt that Karen and I certainly get quite a welcome on our European tours. We've been to England, we've been to France, Belgium. I know that the book's doing well in some of the other countries there. And I think, from my point of view, I've got this kind of notion of Europeans and of their kind of educational level. And in comparison with America, I think in many ways they're a little more open to this kind of secular spirituality where we're really trying to understand our modern world. And we're not necessarily going to just kowtow to, old conventional visions out of religious or scientific sessions. We really want to know more about how this world works today. And we don't want it just from authority. We want to understand it ourselves. And I believe that there are a lot of people in Belgium and in some of the other European countries that seem to really enjoy our work. There certainly are many in the United States, too, and in Canada, Mexico, and South America. But I believe, from my point of view, a lot of this has to do with one's readiness to move to the next level of human understanding. And I think that the more we kind of hold on to traditional systems, especially if they've kind of fallen off the pathway that seems to relate to truth, it's time to leave them behind. Now, that's not to say that some of the deepest truths that I believe are emerging in the modern scientific study of consciousness are not reflective of ancient wisdom out of spiritual traditions, both East and West, that I would say were much closer to the mark than our current materialist science, which is way off the mark when it comes to something like consciousness. And so in many ways, this is just about acknowledging some great wisdom. Some of it may have been here for thousands of years, but it's an understanding that I think will help us get to the next level. It has a lot to do with people not just buying into what the talking heads out there in the world are saying and the media. You know, it turns out, unfortunately, in our current political era, one really has to get used to the notion that people don't seem to care so much about facts and truth anymore. And I believe in this journey, that's especially important, that we be talking about things that are very relevant, that we can prove and show to each other through commonalities in our experience. And it's, you know, the kind of armchair philosopher trying to understand that, especially if they don't have much personal experience kind of in spiritual realms, where they're just going to get lost over it all. So I think it's really time for us to open our minds to much grander possibilities and to use our personal experience to try and grow through that and come to this knowledge by acknowledging the answers lie within us all and really moving forward. But I think, you know, to kind of get back to your question, that the popularity of the books is just, this is kind of a modern thinking man's guide to the universe, and not necessarily just buying into what, you know, voices of authority continue to trumpet. Doesn't seem to align with the facts in people's personal lives. And we really need to move forward. We need to acknowledge, certainly in the world of consciousness studies, it's beginning to look a lot more that the founding fathers of quantum physics were right, that in fact we're really sharing one mind. We can all be individual in our bodies and individual people out there, but it really looks like at the deepest kind of scientific level that we are dealing with one phenomenal consciousness. And I would argue that when you die, when you're freed up from the shackles of the physical brain and body, your soul, your conscious awareness re-emerges, becomes one again with that extraordinary creative and evolutionary power, what many would call a God force. You know, but to me, it's, you know, the religious labels for that force just lead to conflict and a false sense of separation. People are so used to, you know, having God be a push-button word for them, either positive or negative. And I realized very clearly when I came back from my journey, especially as I told my story to bigger and bigger audiences, and I started hearing back from Kabbalists, from Jewish mystics, from Christian mystics, from Sufis, Islamic mystics, from Baha'i faith, from Shintoists, Zoroastrians, Hindus, Buddhists. I mean, many different people telling me that my journey and my kind of telling of that mental exploration and kind of identification of myself and that connection with the universe is something that to them reflected their religious beliefs going way back, but not the religion that comes out of the Orthodox traditions, but more the religion as it's practiced by the mystics within the various faiths, because there it all converges, and from my point of view, to really one deep kind of understanding of oneness and connection with this universe.
Yeah, people like, for example, Niels Bohr and Max Planck and all those people. It's part of your book, isn't it? The last book. But in any case, well, it's strange. We always thought that Americans, people in the US, are far more open to these kind of things than what we are over here. So, it's the other way around. If I listen to you,
I've certainly come to have a great appreciation for what I see as kind of a cultural wisdom that I find when we visit Europe around these issues. And this is not to put down my American compatriots, because there are many people in this country who get this at a very deep level. But I would say in terms of big populations of countries, in many ways, I'm a little more optimistic about some of the Europeans kind of understanding this and getting this and moving to the next level a little more easily than big groups of Americans, even though there are plenty of Americans who also get this and are on board. And I work with literally over 100 scientists around the world who are fast along the pathway of this kind of deeper understanding. And a lot of them are here in the United States. So I don't want to put my country down in any way. But I have been very impressed with kind of the ability of many in some of the European countries that we visited to embrace and open up to some of the deep truths that we're talking about. And this world is definitely in need of this truth because, from my point of view, the false sense of separation we have, the polarization in our politics, the horrific polarization in our economic systems, where, like in the United States, you have basically the top 400 wealthiest families are equivalent in wealth to the bottom 60% of our country. And that is a horrific abomination that must come to an end. I mean, capitalism is a great system if it works, but if all it does is focus all of the wealth in a tiny little group of individuals, it has failed miserably. And that is a lot of what this awakening is about, because when you understand that hurting another is hurting yourself, helping another is helping yourself, when we realize that the deep truths of modern science about consciousness point to the fact that we really are sharing one mind and one consciousness. And so those things are very true. So we need to take care of each other. And when we have polarization in our economic and our political systems, all it's showing us is we've lost sight of a much deeper, richer reality, that we're really all in this together. And we're here to take care of each other. And that's especially important in this age of refugees and ongoing warfare, to take care of the least and the last and the lost. And that is our responsibility as human beings. And that is what will help bring this kind of higher vision of humanity to this planet. The more we can adopt that. And this is not a new message, this is ancient. And yet it is fully supported by the modern science of consciousness studies. We need to pay attention to this, and it is time to shift our belief systems away from the false separation of materialism and into the much richer, scientifically supported era of taking care of each other and showing much more love, compassion, and kindness, beginning with ourselves and then serving as a conduit to spread that out to the world.
Sure. Well, it's encouraging to hear that you think that in Europe a lot is going on too, and we're open to this kind of message. What would be the most important lesson, if you will, the most important message you brought with me from your experience, if you brought into this world from your experience?
I think the most important lesson is each and every soul is crucial in this. You know, people have a way of fooling themselves into thinking that they're not important. Each and every one of us is an astonishing miracle. When you think back on all of the events that occurred over millions and millions of years to lead to your very life right now in this world, it's nothing short of miraculous. And so the more people can realize that each and every soul is critical in this kind of awakening and understanding, and that we're all doing it together, I would say that is probably one of the most important, because I despair when I see anyone believing that they are, not important, that they don't have a purpose in this world.
Sure.
And that is such a crucial thing to say, because so many people in this world, and it's not about being famous or wealthy or anything. All it's about is living your truth through your heart with those around you. Relationships with our fellow human beings is the only thing that matters. Material wealth and building up of material goods does no good other than the fact that you can use it to share the love with others. And really, this world will be a far happier place for all involved as we come to realize this deep and yet what I would say is inevitable truth about our reasons for existence.
Well, I'm hearing the same thing all over again with every interview I do with somebody with an experience, obviously. Can I come back to Steve Taylor? Because in his book, he tells us that in quantum physics, science and spirituality come together. Is that also your opinion?
Absolutely.
Really?
In fact, I would say the reason that I'm so optimistic that this time it's going to be different is I've seen, as we all have, 5,000 plus years of a situation where you'd have the occasional prophet or mystic who had an extraordinary experience showing they're much more about the nature of this universe and about the importance of their existence. And they would share that with others. And then those were taken by human beings and turned into our orthodox religious systems. Unfortunately, something got lost in translation. The original message of the prophets didn't always make it through the entire process. And so what we're left with is, millennia where people didn't generally have their own experiences of seeing that realm and then coming back to this world to talk about it. In the 1960s, everything changed. Doctors developed ways to resuscitate cardiac arrest patients. So since the 1960s, we've now brought back to this world literally tens of millions of souls that have glimpsed the other side, had extraordinary experience to show them that this material existence is only part of what it is to be human, that there's much more to our existence as souls, as spirits, as the conscious awareness that temporarily exists in this body. And the thing that proves it is really quantum physics. And I know there are a lot of quantum physicists out there who say, wait a minute, quantum physics doesn't have anything to do with consciousness. And that doesn't reflect their ignorance of quantum physics, but it does reflect that they know a little less about consciousness than many of the scientists who study consciousness. And what I will tell you is that what makes it different this time is quantum physics not only allows for the reality of a spiritual universe, it demands it. And that has to do with the measurement paradox. It has to do with what's called contextuality, which is the fact that the mind and the machinations of the mind in designing experiments, for example, in how to look at a photon, whether you want to assess its particle or its wave qualities, at the end of the day, that mental decision, which is not something that's derived from physical matter at all, defines what emerges in the physical universe. And in fact, what the findings of quantum physics are so powerful and kind of mind-changing about the nature of reality that a lot of physicists would choose as their interpretation of the measurement paradox, which is really the kind of exact problem where this intersection of mind and matter comes to the fore. And many of them would interpret the results of quantum physical experiments and simply say that all you need to explain that is infinite parallel universes. That is what's called Hugh Everett's 1957 many worlds interpretation. In fact, if you poll modern physicists in the year 2019, you'll find that most of them will subscribe to that as their explanation for the interpretation of the measurement paradox in quantum physics. The reality is, if you admit that consciousness is fundamental and that we're sharing consciousness, and we elaborate this tremendously in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we talk about how the brain is more of a filter, that consciousness is primordial. When you die, you experience that primordial consciousness, but you can also experience it through meditation. There are ways to slip through the veil and come into much more broad connection with that universal consciousness. And it turns out, though, getting back to your question, that essentially it's quantum physics itself, which has been very unyielding on this issue. And we argue for objective idealism, that is, that the entire universe is idealistic. That is, it operates mainly with a top-down order and causality from the mental realm, just as was explained by Richard Kahn Henry in his Nature essay in 2005, where he talked about the mental universe. He was the head of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins. He knew what he was talking about, that mental universe. And so now quantum physics demands that mental layer of top-down causality. That is the same kind of thinking as David Bohm had in his earlier interpretation of quantum physics, where he talked about the implicate and explicate order, and his notion of a pilot wave, a guiding wave that had mental characteristics. But the point of all this is that science is what is now demanding that the mental be placed at the center of the evolving notions of creation and evolution of the universe. And this has a lot to do with our understanding of our potential and where this is all going. But just as Steve points out in his beautiful book about spiritual science, we talk about in Living in Mindful Universe how the science is actually what is going to drive all this. And it's coming to the deeper understanding of quantum physics, which ultimately can only be done as we begin to more fully understand objective idealism. Otherwise known would be metaphysical or ontological idealism would be synonyms for objective idealism. But they're all really talking about that mental layer of the universe as being causal and influential in the entire evolution of all that happens in human lives.
Mm-hmm. I must admit that reading through your book at chapter 3, it became quite difficult for me to get my head around all the different aspects of quantum physics and that sort of stuff. But in any case,
I apologize for that. It can be a little challenging, and I'm trying to clean up how I describe it all.
I had to read it a couple of times before I could get my head around it, to be quite honest with you. But eventually did.
I tried it about 20 times before it made enough sense to publish it.
And if you listen to a lot of scientists explaining quantum physics, everybody tells another story or explains it in another way. In your book, Proof of Heaven, you tell us that most scientists still choose to ignore the fact that you can detect consciousness. That was very interesting to me. How? Where? I mean, keeping in mind that consciousness is a subjective kind of experience, but you're saying you can actually detect it. Is that correct?
There are ways, for example, in anesthesia to monitor people's nervous system and at least get some idea of how deep they are. There are other kind of more modern techniques that are evolving, something that Christopher Koch refers to as zip and zap, which is different ways of using evoked potentials and transcranial mag stem in ways to assess the response of the nervous system. But, you know, all of this goes far deeper than that, because the consciousness I'm talking about is the big consciousness. How do you explain things like reincarnation, that memories and experience can go from one lifetime to another, even though there's no physical vessel that is conveying the memories between them? You can't really look at the genome as harboring that kind of information. And in fact, a lot of it is outside of the world of genetics, outside of the world of heredity. A lot of our soul connections are not necessarily just with our, our biologically, hereditarily related members of our group. But consciousness writ large is what I'm talking about, and that's where this all gets very exciting. I mean, if I had this kind of a discussion before my coma, I really wouldn't have even known the full kind of scale and scope of consciousness and brain and mind and reality and all the possible versions to explain it all. I would have defaulted to the simplistic assumption that the physical world is there and exists independently of me and my mind. And I would have been completely wrong. That's one of the deepest and most profound aspects of quantum physics, is it tells us none of this exists without the mind of the observer. And that is a part that, we've had 400 years of the scientific revolution trying to pretend that there's an objective physical world out there that lives in four-dimensional space-time, and it goes by its own rules, and they don't have anything to do with the rules that govern, mentation and human thought and phenomenology. Turns out that's not true. And I would say the biggest mistake has been that scientists, especially in the mid-20th century, thought that what we're talking about here is only human consciousness that obviously had to wait for human beings to evolve for it to exist. What they failed to acknowledge was you can flip it just very slightly and realize that there can be a form of consciousness, a layer of understanding in this universe, of assimilation and integration of information that can be available to human beings, that is not the lowly little bottom-up causality of the physical world, but actually is something far loftier. and that would be kind of that mind of the deity. I mean, I don't want to use the name of a deity and don't want to even invoke your God force, because, you know, for a scientist, they say, wait a minute, you can't play that card. But the reality is, if you want to talk about consciousness at all, we really have to go into this territory where we realize the brain is not the creator of it at all. And that, of course, is what we talk about extensively in Living in a Mindful Universe. There are other recent books out that cover the same topic. I would recommend Mark Gober's book, The End of Upside Down Thinking. It's a very good book that gets right to the heart of all this kind of nonsense of materialist science. In fact, I would say that scientific materialism is really the new pseudoscience, because, in fact, most of the scientists in that group who still are not getting it. For example, if you look at Jessica Utz, who is the head of the American Statistical Association, she gave a talk in 2015 when she was the president of that group about her work in parapsychology. She had done very deep scientific studies of both precognition and of remote viewing. From her point of view, there's no doubt, no reasonable doubt scientifically and statistically that precognition and remote viewing, or psychic spy programs, are absolutely real. It's been proven. And yet when she gave that talk to her scientifically minded audience of statisticians, more than 6,000 of them from 62 different countries, and asked them, what would you want, more data or personal experience? Almost universally, this group of scientists and statisticians said, I want personal experience. That is the key. More data, more data. The data is already there. If you go out and study it, read books like Irreducible Mind, read books like Beyond Physicalism, both those from Ed Kelly and the wonderful group of scientists at University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, or just go to their website, uvadops.org, and you'll learn a tremendous amount about this emerging scientific worldview. And this is where the world is headed. And it absolutely will involve a marriage, an annulment of the divorce between our scientific and intellectual technological capabilities and our spiritual side, which went through a divorce in the 19th and 20th and early 21st century. And I would say that it is time to annul that divorce, because as we get through a deeper understanding of quantum physics and what it's trying to tell us, it's inevitable, as the most proven field in the history of science. What it tells us about the primacy of mind and consciousness is real, and that's what we'll be getting used to as we come to a deeper understanding of this. But the good news is this is a very liberating gift for human beings, for all of us. When you understand that we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe, and that reincarnation, according to scientific study, has a very real basis in reality, it really opens the doors to a much richer world, but one that I will say also must incorporate, because of the knowledge that comes bundled with it, much more kindness, compassion, and taking care of each other. Because we can no longer subscribe to that myth of materialist science that tries to pretend that we're separate beings, or the myth of Darwinian evolution. Now, Darwinian evolution is very real, but in fact, there's a far bigger form of evolution going on that I would say Teilhard de Chardin hit on in his book, The Phenomenon of Man, in the mid-20th century, that all of consciousness is evolving. And in fact, it was some of the materialist misreading of Darwin's work that led to that notion of survival of the fittest and, defeat your competitor because only the strong survive, etc., which is not the way the biological world works. Ask any biologist. Cooperation and collaboration are keys to success in the biological world. In fact, if you read Ascent of Man by Darwin, the phrase survival of the fittest appears twice. The word love appears 98 times. It's because he wasn't the one who warped his version of evolution into what Thomas Huxley and others purported. You have to be strong and defeat everyone else to survive. That's not the way it works. And we've got to get rid of that kind of thinking and take care of each other and also take care of this planet. Because God knows we've done a tremendous amount of damage to the ecosystems already. Some people pretend, oh, we've only got 10 more years to get it right. Well, wrong. We've already gotten it wrong, and all we're doing now is the longer we perpetuate our addiction to fossil fuels, the much, much worse we will make it for our children, grandchildren, and all of our descendants. So it is time now to start addressing climate change, get rid of our addiction to fossil fuels, and stop making all these single-use plastics that are choking the world to death. Mm-hmm. It is high time that we grew into this kind of higher vision of ourselves and where we can take this planet.
It struck me, you were talking about Mark Gober with his end of upside down thinking. This is a businessman, if I'm not mistaken, isn't it? It's not a scientist who wrote the book, he was a businessman.
He's a smart one.
Yeah. Anyhow, there's at present, there's quite a debate in Holland, in Netherlands, about organ donation. It's perhaps a difficult question, that one. And the law is changing at the beginning of 2020. You know, it's going to be the same as it was in Belgium before, that you automatically are an organ donor unless you tell them not to. You know, you don't want to be an organ donor. Can I have your views on this? Because Pim van Lommel has got quite strong views on organ donation.
Well, I know he does, and I must say, you know, having spent 25 years of my life as a neurosurgeon, we often have patients who, you know, in horrible accidents, gunshot wounds, motor vehicle accidents, hemorrhage into the brain, things like that. We very, very often have people who are brain dead. And so I still tend to look at the whole issue of organ donation very heavily as a surgeon who was had a passionate interest in trying to make sure that organs that could be of use to other human beings were not buried in the ground. And so for that reason, you know, I paid a lot of attention to the brain death criteria that were first devised in the late 1960s. We would put those criteria to great use over time. I'm an organ donor. It says that on my on my Virginia driver's license. And I still strongly support organ donation. Now, of course, it's very important that physicians be right there at the top of the game in terms of brain death criteria and how these are performed and what they say about a patient's potential for recovery or not. But what I usually tell patients is that I believe that prayer can have tremendous power. And, you know, when you look back on my case, it really was a miraculous healing. And in fact, there's a case report that came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September of 2018 by 3 doctors who were not involved in my care, but it talks about my medical records. And they make a very strong case for kind of miraculous recovery as it's seen in NDEs. I do not believe our medical world is yet at a point where we can rely heavily enough on kind of that the spiritual power of healers and all to take us to that next level. So I think we're still kind of betwixt and between world here, where I still am a strong proponent of properly managed organ donation. And I know that others, Pim, might differ quite a bit with that. Again, I cannot stress enough that the brain death criteria have to be rigorously applied in that kind of a setting. But what I often tell families who contact me, if they have a loved one who's in coma or something like that, is you know, that prayer can have a tremendous impact, but it's not a situation where I believe one needs to go for long periods of time, giving that prayer its potential for bringing people back. And if your physician team has applied near-death criteria and they feel that a patient is brain dead, you know, the chances for any kind of meaningful recovery in that situation, if it's all been properly done, is vanishingly rare. And so still, I find myself having one foot in both worlds. I cannot stand the thought of organs being buried when they could be put to use in people to live lives in the here and now. They should not be buried with people who have such horrific injuries or damage that they'll never have any kind of quality of life again. Again, we're relying heavily on the medical professionals to determine that in each individual case, and I realize that sometimes that system does fall short. But as a general principle, I feel that we still need to honor that kind of an approach.
Understood. Well, there's a lot of debate going on, of course, on what is really a brain dead. There's a biological brain dead, clinical brain dead, and so forth. There's a lot of that sort of debate going on over here.
Well, I feel my general feeling is that you have to be very stringent there. I feel that if you're going to be harvesting organs, that you really have to have very stringent criteria. That involve blood flow, EEG measurements, all of the clinical criteria over more than 24 hours, the appropriate temperature settings, etc. It really needs to be rigorously applied.
Yeah. Most NDEs find it really hard to adapt to everyday life. I presume that's a question you've also had quite a couple of times. After that experience, it takes sometimes months, and I've talked to people who it took years. 18, 19, 20 years.
It can easily take years.
Yeah. It seemed as if it wasn't that difficult for you, if I'm reading.
I went through kind of an incredible process. You got to remember that when I first came back to this world after 7 days of coma, when I woke up in that ICU bed, my brain was so wrecked, I didn't even recognize loved ones at the bedside. Like my mother, my sisters, my sons, I had no idea who these beings were. And I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life. In fact, when I first came back to this world, I had no language, no memories of Earth. And language came back very rapidly, literally over hours, over a few days, a lot of childhood memories. And everything, as best I can tell, all my memories came back within about 2 months after coma. Now, I was still on this incredible up and down roller coaster ride of understanding. As I had tried to explain to my doctors my near-death experience when I was still in the hospital, when I had no recovery of my knowledge of brain and mind and meningitis or anything. All I was doing was trying to share my recent reality with them. And they would just tell me, well, you were very, very, very sick. But in fact, we can't understand how you're even coming back to this world. Your brain was soaking in pus. We have no explanation for your return. But you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. And so I took them at their word and just assumed it had to be some vast hallucination. I mean, as I told my son, who was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time, when it was 2 days out of the hospital and he came home for Thanksgiving break back in 2008, I told him it was way too real to be real. To me, that just meant it was some massive hallucination that had to do with meningitis and what it does to your brain. But I didn't realize at that time. It took months of going back, reviewing my medical records, talking over with my doctors, and this is something that's revealed fully in that case report that came out September 2018, Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, is there really is no Western medical explanation for my recovery. And likewise, there's no explanation within our current neuroscience for how I could have had any such robust ultra-real experience. I should have been incapable, based on the documented damage to all 8 lobes of my brain. I should have been incapable of any kind of dream, hallucination, confabulation, any kind of mental phenomenal experience. What we know about the structure of the neocortex and the damage to mind should have gotten rid of all of that. And the biggest mystery at the end of the day is the recovery. And in fact, the doctors who wrote up my case had trouble getting it published because the peer reviewers at some of the medical journals said, things don't line up here. This is not somebody who went on to recover. That was what haunted me when I was first going through my medical records. I said, wait a minute. This is not somebody who's going to live through this. This is deadly. And especially in trying to figure out how you could have an experience when all those parts of the brain were so damaged. And that's why it took them a while to get it published. It took them more than 2 years, really, to write up the whole review of my records and then get it published. And one of the reasons they gave that allowed the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, very bravely as a peer-reviewed medical journal, to accept it, was they said the reason I recovered after such a devastating illness was because of the spiritual content of my near-death experience. that contributed to bringing me back to this world. Just as in the cases of, say, Anita Moorjani, who wrote the book Dying to Be Me and had a advanced stage 4 lymphoma that should have killed her within hours. That was back in February 2006 when she checked into an emergency room in Hong Kong in coma. And I presented with her several times, and I assure you to this day she's very healthy. Or the story of Dr. Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon who was in a kayaking accident in Chile. She wrote a book, To Heaven and Back. That was in the late 1990s. She had a profound NDE. Her NDE was a kayak going to the bottom of the riverbed, smashing, breaking her legs under a boulder, underwater, more than 30 minutes. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a neurosurgeon to tell you more than 30 minutes in a warm water drowning, forget about it. Well, they brought her back to the surface. She was dead, but they resuscitated her. She ended up making a complete recovery, went back to being an orthopedic surgeon and traveling the world as I do, sharing her phenomenal story. These stories are a cultural asset because they show us something about humans and human spirit and the power of mind over matter. It's really placebo effect on steroids. You know, physicians have honored mind over matter for more than 60 years by using placebo effect as the gold standard to assess any new medical treatment. Well, turns out that placebo effect is just the medical profession acknowledging that a patient's beliefs can have tremendous power. And this is not just about a headache going away or hip pain going away. If you go to noetic.org and put in the search term spontaneous remission, you will find a book that they wrote in the mid-1990s with more than 3,500 cases, advanced cancers, infections, all kinds of illness and injury that reversed just because patients believed in many cases that it could get better. We have tremendous power in mind over matter, and that is where I believe the richest lessons coming from the spiritual awakening are of great relevance to all of us.
The question, of course, is do scientists read this kind of stories? I mean, you find them in so many books as examples of Mojani, for example, in a stage 3 cancer and so forth, and she recovered, yours and others. Anyhow, I've asked the people I interviewed if they had any questions for you, if I may. In short, Raymond has a question about the relationship between brain and consciousness, and I'm reading now because about the position taken by Hameroff and Penrose. You're obviously aware of them.
There's
The Oak-Or theory, yes, which I'm sure you know. Pim van Lommel, whom I also had the privilege to interview, tells us that the brain is a sender-receiver of consciousness. That's his theory. What is your view on this heart problem? We call it the heart problem in English, if I'm not mistaken. Keeping in mind that your background is scientific, your scientific background, your conventional background. In fact, your materialistic background, isn't it?
Correct. But also I've had an experience that demanded more in terms of my explanation. And what I would say, and this is something that we explain very fully in Living in a Mindful Universe, but just to cut to the chase, I would agree with Pim van Lommel very closely. In fact, what I would say is that the universe works through this objective form of idealism, where mind is what exists and then generates all of emergent matter, so that the entire observable physical universe comes out of that realm of consciousness. That's where the top-down causality is apparent. So the brain is seen not as the creator or producer of consciousness, which it would be, in the reductive materialist or physicalist model, but the brain is seen as a filter. It's called filter theory. And filter theory only allows in that primordial consciousness, in this tiny little trickle of an apparent here and now and sense of self. But in fact, filter theory is not a new idea. Filter theory, from my point of view, was promulgated especially by William James, the renowned Harvard psychologist back at the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries. And he spoke a lot in his work of assessing various aspects of human psychology, he referred a lot to filter theory as being very crucial. But likewise, at the same time, you had philosophers in other countries like Henri Bergson in France, F.C.S. Schiller in England, Aldous Huxley in the United States, who was the nephew of Thomas Huxley, the same one who took Darwinian evolution in that very militant, kill your enemy or else version of Darwinian ideas. But anyway, Aldous Huxley had come a long way away from his uncle, and he'd had some psychedelic drug experiences, and he also thought filter theory was the way to honor it all. And filter theory gets some very respectful treatment in, for example, in Ed Kelly's books, in Irreducible Mind and in Beyond Physicalism. Filter theory is something that's covered quite extensively because it really is a good way to start making sense of all of this. And I would say that the modern, the hard problem is not a hard problem for consciousness itself, because obviously consciousness exists, but the hard problem is so deep, and that the hard problem is just the philosophical linkage between brain and mind. But it is so deep and profound that what it shows is an absolutely fatal flaw in scientific materialism. You cannot escape it. In fact, Daniel Dennett and some of the other promoters of that view of the brain creates consciousness, they go so far as to say none of us are conscious. We're all zombies. And I would say that might be true for Daniel Dennett, but it's certainly not true for most of the souls I meet in this journey. And it's a very crucial thing to be pointing out to this world, that modern neuroscience is evolving very rapidly, but it's away from the bleak and paltry fiction of materialist science that pretends that when you die, that's the end of your awareness, because they falsely believe that the brain is creating consciousness out of physical matter.
Thank you. Magdalena had a question with regards to BD and awareness, with NDE, of course it is in English, and awareness. She saw herself from an out-of-body perspective and describes it as an indescribable experience. Could it be, she asks, that an NDE shows us how we will eventually evolve as spiritual beings?
I would say the NDE shows that very beautifully, but I also often remark that you could never, ever take just the NDE experience and extrapolate it to say this is absolute proof of the afterlife. And the problem is, of course, NDEers don't die. They come back to this world. Now, that should still give any thinking, intellectual, curious person great cause to wonder, why would they have the experience that they have? And why is it that they come back almost universally unafraid of death? That is a very crucial thing to ask yourself if you want to entertain these questions. But I would say, yes, the NDE, especially when you study them by the hundreds and thousands, they paint quite a clear picture of the kind of expectations we should have. The important thing to remember, though, is they're not always the same, because every NDE is geared to the individual soul that's going through it. So even though they have commonalities and shared qualities that scientists who study them can line up and kind of assess, the deeper reality is that every NDE is for the soul who has it. And that's why mine had its own kind of unusual characteristics, like the fact that I was amnesic. Most NDEers are not amnesic. They go in and they remember all those features of their life that help them line things up in the afterlife. I guess I just needed to learn different things on my NDE, and that's why I had to be amnesic. I learned a tremendous amount about consciousness. And I suspect if I had scripted this, and if, for example, my father, who had passed over 4 years before my coma, if he had been there in my NDE, I might have been tempted to believe that you see who you want to see on the way out. And I would have been tempted to dismiss it, in spite of the fact that I had a 1 in 10 million diagnosis, a 1 in a billion recovery. If my father had been my guardian angel there, I might have been tempted to say, wow, that sure was weird, but I guess that's what I expected to see. But the universe had a different trick in mind for me, because what I discovered 4 months after my coma was the identity to that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing. And I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't read the book Proof of Heaven, but that deep recognition 4 months after my coma was what shocked me into admitting the reality of my journey, and then coming to sense with, oh, now I really have to explain this from a scientific fashion. And that is what has driven my last 11 years of work and will continue to drive me for the rest of my time in this particular incarnation.
Thank you. A few short ones. Rita says that in a longing for the light, the sublime, she calls it, fortunately isn't as strong as before I interviewed her. She says that she knows for sure what's waiting for her on the other side. She asks if a strong desire to be in the light will be more bearable as time goes on. She says whether she will find peace in the coming years of her life before she passes over. She clearly had a problem before I interviewed her with this kind of thing, you know. She wanted to go back to she was homesick. Can I put it that way?
Well, you know, that's a very, very common experience. I would say, to me, it's kind of shocking how in our kind of me-focused, material-focused world that we live in, that still the majority of people who have had a near-death experience come back going, oh my God, that is so beautiful. I long for that. That is my spiritual home. I want to return there. And in fact, most people who come back to this world came back because they had a responsibility. They had another soul they had to come back and take care of. In fact, the whole reason I came back in the moment of my coming back was my awareness at the end of my journey of the 6 faces that appeared to me out of the muck. And then finally, the 6th face was of my 10-year-old son, Bond. Now, I didn't remember him. I didn't know who he was. I had no idea at the time, but his pleading with me, you're going to be okay, you're going to be okay. I didn't understand the words, but I now knew for the first time in that entire 7-day journey that seemed to last for years, that I had a responsibility to another soul, and I had to come back. This is why I think it's so important to stress that not only are these kind of situations, this kind of understanding, proof of a, quote, afterlife, but I think it's more important for people to understand that they show the continuity of consciousness in reincarnation, and they support that fully. And the reason I say that is there are some people who are suffering in this world and they feel that the correct move is to commit suicide. That is never the correct move, because in fact there's a whole literature on people who almost committed suicide but didn't really succeed and then regretted it terrifically. And they regret it especially if they have an NDE. In fact, Raymond Moody will tell you one of the few things that he can say with almost complete assurance based on his 5-decade study of this phenomenon is that if someone tries to commit suicide and has any of the elements of an NDE, if they encounter souls of departed loved ones, their higher soul, they encounter that God force of pure love, they go through a life review or any elements of it, they come back here realizing life is very precious, the universe has tremendous love for them, and that there's absolutely no reason to end your existence in this incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I've read somewhere that it's like going from the bottom of the ocean and coming up a couple of 100 meters and then going straight into what do you call it? Those things which they throw into the water when you're drowning.
An inner tube or a life vest?
Yeah, a life vest. It's as difficult as this, isn't it?
Yes.
Guy says that some NDEs have so-called paranormal powers, such as laying on hands, healing powers, clairvoyance, etc. He asks, is it spirit activating these kind of powers, or are these latent in all of us?
I would say they're latent in all of us. And that is a very important point. In fact, I would say no one needs, a profound NDE or shared death experience or to come to this kind of knowledge. If you study a bit, if you're familiar with some of the books and talks, and if you take the time to do personal experience, go within, meditate. Sacred acoustics is the tool I use. And for anyone who needs a tool for getting deep into altered states of conscious awareness, I would recommend you visit sacredacoustics.com. Now, full disclosure, that company was co-founded by my partner, Karen Newell, who is also the co-author of the book Living in a Mindful Universe. But I use Sacred Acoustics an hour or two every day. I have been doing that the last 10 years. And I think it's because these differential frequency sounds have a major impact in the lower brainstem as opposed to up in the acoustic cortex where most sounds are processed. And we explain all that much more fully in Living in a Mindful Universe. But the general idea is it's the process of these sounds in the lower brainstem that I believe gives them so much power. And if you go to sacredacoustics.com, she has a testimonials page where you can see the kind of impact this has had for literally hundreds of people who have benefited from this kind of meditation. Really, any way you have of centering prayer, of deep meditation, that enables you to turn off the little voice in the head. So many of us think the voice in the head is who I am. The little running stream of thoughts in my head is who I am. That is not true. And they think that little running stream of thoughts is your consciousness. That is not true. Your consciousness is your awareness of all that. And what I will tell you is you can expand that conscious awareness tremendously. And you can do that most easily by learning to put that little voice in your head. And I love how Michael Singer puts it in his book, The Untethered Soul. He calls that little running stream of consciousness in our head, he calls it the annoying roommate. Mm-hmm. Don't lose sight of that term. That's all it is. It's little more than a parlor trick. The extreme magic of consciousness is not that little voice and your little rational, logical thoughts, but it is the awareness. And by exploring that awareness, and especially when you realize filter theory is absolutely real, that our brain is not producing consciousness, it's only filtering in primordial consciousness, that's when you realize, if I have something like Sacred Acoustics, that allows me to kind of get around that veiling function, that filtering function, and start exploring universal consciousness, primordial mind, that has tremendous power. And that's what I would encourage each and every one of your listeners to do.
I've tried, I've by coincidence, I've downloaded the 20 minutes tryout on the website, yes. So that was yesterday. I'm quite curious to start using it and see what happens.
Recommend, she has several free videos on sacredacoustics.com that are tips for little tricks you can use and kind of ideas, understandings, and they're very simple and straightforward little kind of sound bites, video bites, but they're very useful. And I would encourage you to find those on sacredacoustics.com, look at those, and then that'll give you kind of a mindset for how to use that file to really get deep into it.
I definitely will. I saw it yesterday, and as I said, I downloaded the 20 minutes tryout, so I'm going to try that. That's from tomorrow. Yeah. The experiences of do you know about Bob Monroe? Obviously, you know about Bob yes. Monroe. Yes. Yes. What do you think about those experiences and specifically his experiences? Can I have your views on that one?
Yeah. Well, Bob Monroe, he wrote 3 books on his out-of-body experiences back in the late 20th century, and I think he was a very wise and capable explorer. He kind of stumbled into something in 1958 that, using sound, and he found that he could get out of body. And then he wrote about it extensively. And I think he did a lot of very good work about that. In fact, he was, his institute, the Monroe Institute, is where Karen and I met. We were both actually working there and very interested in using sound for getting into deep transcendental states. So I think Monroe did some wonderful work. Unfortunately, when he left the physical world in March of 1995, there were certain forces afoot that kind of prevented the Monroe Institute and other purveyors of his products from doing much fundamental research. And in fact, that was a big reason why Sacred Acoustics was invented, was to try and fill that gap and do a lot of the fundamental scientific research to take binaural beats and kind of advance audio brain entrainment to a new level. And I think people who use Sacred Acoustics will agree. It certainly has come a long way since some of those early efforts, although I will certainly express my admiration for Bob Monroe and a lot of the work he did.
Scientists, Guy says, would like to understand the connection between matter and consciousness. He says, what interplay of energies, both material and spiritual, will be necessary to make this possible? He says, is it anyhow possible to do this from a physical, materialistic approach?
I mean, I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that.
Yeah, he says that scientists would like to understand that, and you've touched on that one several times, the connection between matter and consciousness. They're trying to understand that, or at least some of them. I'm sure you know about the Galileo Commission also.
Yes, of course, GalileoCommission.org.
Yeah. He says the interplay of energies, so both material and spiritual, will be necessary to make this possible. Is it anyhow possible to do this from starting from a physical, materialistic kind of approach?
We have to use all the tools available. I know I've promoted ever since Proof of Heaven came out. I've been a strong proponent that I believe that the afterlife and reincarnation are scientific questions. But that doesn't mean that we're quite at a point where we can set up randomized, double-blind, controlled studies. We have to use science as best we can. I know Richard Feynman in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech when he won the Nobel Prize in Physics, he said there's a tremendous amount of truth in this universe that will never be demonstrable using scientific methods. So we have to get ourselves used to the idea that a lot of knowledge, especially through deep personal experience, deep in consciousness, the kind of things we can come to know, are not necessarily going to be things that we can prove, in a materialist scientific fashion. But an example I often give is, say, the studies that have come out, multiple studies in the last few years, using functional MRI and more recently magnetoencephalography to assess the brains of people under the influence of powerful psychedelic drugs, like psilocybin, as the original paper from Robin Carhart Harris and others at Imperial College of London in 2012 reported that the interesting thing is that you find the brain goes dark. So we use these techniques that materialist science has come to rely on, and all we find is that the brain, in these phenomenal drug experiences, the brain is shutting off. That's a scientifically valid data point. It's showing us that we're not going to answer all the questions about the nature of the experience by simply looking at our fMRI better. Because the fMRI is sitting there telling you the brain is going dark now. I don't have much more to tell you. So in other words, filter theory is true. Primordial consciousness is true. And we need to open our minds to all the rich ways to explore this and understand it. It involves all the work, for example, done by Division of Perceptual Studies scientists who interview children about past life memories, who interview people who've had near-death experiences. And although a lot of this information is, quote, anecdotal, it's still very important, especially where it overlaps and where all of it starts to put a consistent picture forward. Science is really about understanding everything. The scientific method, in many ways, is somewhat restricted. And as much as possible, we need to come up with ways to use that method, because that's a good pathway towards objective knowledge that we can share with others. But at the end of the day, just as I said earlier, the first step you take in meditation is realizing the little voice in your head is not who you are, and putting that little annoying roommate into timeout. And that kind of approach is not necessarily going to take us into things that the scientific community in the current era is going to be satisfied with. But we really have to be multidisciplinary about it, and we have to be open-minded about it all.
Do you think there will ever be a time where we will accept paranormal kind of powers? Will they be normal one day?
Let's put it this way. The word paranormal, the word parapsychology, in many ways is misleading, unless you want to talk about para-consciousness, as if consciousness, we don't care about it, okay? If you care about consciousness, and if you'll admit that consciousness is a feature of the natural world, we need to throw out this kind of silly small-mindedness of saying, oh, it's only parapsychology, or, it's only paranormal. No, consciousness is fully normal. We're talking about all the various expressions of consciousness, And so we should really throw those words out the window. And for those who talk about this as, oh, that's all spiritualist nonsense, we want science. Well, I'll tell you what, the cutting edge of science today is absolutely spot on, involving our spiritual nature and consciousness itself, and all the evidence for non-local consciousness, things like precognition, telepathy, psychokinesis. These are all very real, scientifically validated phenomena. And if you study the evidence, you'll find that to be true. And really what this world needs to do is we need to start investigating how all of us can more fully develop our abilities of extended consciousness. And that's what this science is addressing. And it's all about making this world a far better place, because that acknowledgement is fully quantum at its heart. And by being quantum at its heart, that means we're talking about the one mind and about a universal top-down causal principle that involves all of us from the mental universe. And that's the part we need to figure out.
Thank you. One last question. Is there a new book in the making?
Well, the more I go through these interviews and presentations, the more I realize, yes. I will tell you, I haven't really started writing it yet, but it's forming up in my mind tremendously. Karen and I are working on several projects now. One is called the Practitioner Training Course for Mental Wellness, and that is mainly for practitioners, but also Inner Sanctum Center. People who want to learn more about that can go to innersanctumcenter.com, but it really is all about really achieving world peace through acknowledging that our inner world becomes our outer world. As you realize this deep and profound scientific truth that's emerging around the nature of human consciousness and consciousness in general, it really opens the door to some tremendous potential. And that's where we're going in innersanctumcenter.com and with other efforts that we're doing. But yes, I think another book really must be in the works. It's time to really put all this together. Living in a Mindful Universe does a lot towards that goal, but you're right. So much has happened, even in the last 2 years since that book came out, along the lines of quantum physics and our deeper understanding of it all, that another book is warranted. So I'll get working on it.
Looking forward to it, sir. Rest me to thank you very much for your time.